Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have an occasion to talk about this remarkable anthology that Jed has created. But before we start, I did want to say just a few words about the Library of America and how we came to publish this book. As many of you may know, we're an independent, nonprofit publisher. That is to say, we're not a subset of any larger entity, and we have a mission of publishing the best and most significant American writing of all eras and in a wide range of genres. We've published since 1981 over 350 titles, and nearly all of them are in print. In the beginning, the series tended to focus on single author volumes devoted to canonical writers, Melville, Emerson, Willa Cather, William Faulkner. As time has gone by, we have greatly expanded the scope of the series and our sense of what we mean by the best and most significant American writing. We've published volumes devoted to historical events like the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, told through first-hand accounts, collections of sermons, political speeches, science fiction, and crime novels. But until now, we had not really dealt with the visual arts at all, except in for a few instances, an edition of Audubon, profusely illustrated, and a two-volume set devoted to the wordless woodcut novels of Lynd Ward. And I had a notion of somehow getting the history of American art through first-hand writing into a single volume. I mentioned this to Jed, and he rightly thought that was not a great idea. And he had the much better idea of focusing on a shorter period, which happens to coincide with maybe the most extraordinary explosion of creativity in the history of American art. I'll leave that to Jed, that judgment to Jed. But in any event, this made it possible to do a book that was much more detailed and much more dense. And the result is something that for us is the kind of book we really aim for ideally. It's not simply a collection of art criticism, although it has as a kind of spinal cord a really solid lineup of crucial art criticism from the period, but it also contains writing by artists and writing by many others not necessarily associated with art writing, and in many forms: letters, diaries, artist statements, poetry. There's a lot of poetry in the book, as befits a period where many poets were deeply involved in the art world. There's even a novel excerpt. There are some interviews. And the book is profusely illustrated, but really the writing is central here. It's really about the writing, and I have found it an extraordinarily surprising book to be involved with. If you read it straight through, which I recommend, all kinds of conversations. Yeah. Wow. As a kind of a novel. I think of it as a novel with there are 87 different writers in the book. So, it's a novel with a lot of characters. And you get conversations, you get arguments, you get some profound quarrels about very basic questions about art. You get all kinds of echoes and parallels that are not intended, but which crop up. I noted that early on, you have Peggy Guggenheim saying about Jackson Pollock, "To me, he was like a trapped animal who never should have left Wyoming." And then many pages later, John Cage says about Jasper Johns, "He is other for whom to have been born is captivity." Alone, he accepts the stricture as a wild animal can. William Hazlitt's 1825 book, The Spirit of the Age, came to mind. That title, I think, could equally well apply to this, even though the subject is art. The concerns are all the concerns of the culture, and that convergence of energies, I think, really is what emerges so powerfully from the book within this post-war period. And above all, since the writing is the focus, the variety of style and the pressure that you can feel on these writers to find a language, to forge a language, to deal with the art that they're writing about, and they take many different approaches to doing that. And I did want to quote just one of many. Robert Creeley, a great poet who much involved with the art world and who collaborated with many artists in the course of his life. He's writing here about the sculptor John Chamberlain, and he's trying to do something to language that is a kind of analog to what he sees in Chamberlain's art. You will not live long if you look always for what was there, assuming the world to be no more than the time track of your particularities, a sudden crash, a disfigurement, the loss of anything not simply a pencil or some wish, and all becomes a present so huge it falls on you, crushing you more than that automobile you thought so neatly to remember. It was there, but now you are contained in a thing already changing, bringing you into its terms, and your house shrinks far off, and things are bright and twisted. And on that note,
wow. I don't know quite what to say about that. When I started talking with Geoffrey about doing this book, the thing that interested me about it was the possibility of dealing with this period, and I think we originally were going to do 1945 to 65, and then somehow the 25 years seemed a more natural trajectory, and we kept finding things we loved that were like in 1966 or 67, so it ended up being 25 years. But the thing that attracted me here was that it would be possible, I thought, with this incredibly sympathetic group of people at the Library of America, to do a book that would include what we think of as the sort of standard inevitable texts, ranging from Clement Greenberg's American type painting to Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood, but at the same time to bring into an anthology, to bring into the story all kinds of other things, writings by Annie Albers on tapestry, Grace Hardigan's amazing journals, an essay by Louis Finkelstein, who I know is a friend of this institution, the New York Studio School, Sidney Tillum, a fabulous critic in the 60s mostly, who's not has never been anthologized. So for me, part of the attraction of this was to be able to sort of expand the story, and then of course we brought in poets. We've got Mae Swenson. We brought in, Mary McCarthy wrote about Harold Rosenberg's writing about art. Tennessee Williams wrote a fascinating brief text about Hans Hofmann, who was a friend of his. They hung out at summers in Provincetown. So for me, part of the great attraction of doing this was, to be perfectly honest, the hope that, given this is being published by the Library of America, which has a certain cachet in the sort of official larger world of the Academy and so on, the hope that maybe we could produce a volume that would suggest that the story of American art is not just Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg and Michael Fried. But in fact, there are lots and lots of other things that can be brought into the story. And Geoffrey, who's a poet himself and very sympathetic to the kinds of interweavings that you have, in fact, in the 50s and 60s in this world, was very anxious to do that. The other thing I should say is when we start talking about where to have events, I mean, the New York Studio School leapt to mind because, of course, many of the protagonists in this book spoke here. I mean, I remember hearing Clement Greenberg here give one of his rather infrequent late talks when I was a young tad an undergraduate at Columbia, and I had friends who were studying at the New York Studio School. In the fall of 1971, I remember coming here one afternoon when Philip Guston, who has two, I think, are there two essays by Guston or one? Philip Guston is marvelous, certainly two essays in this book. When Guston, who taught here, was devoted, Philip Guston and Mercy's Matter, who had so much to do with founding the school, were going around giving critiques late one afternoon. And I had a friend at that point who I'd met at a summer art school the summer before, and I think one of the peak experiences of his life was late that afternoon when Philip Guston and Matter were very, very drunk at that point. They had obviously been drinking since lunch. It was late in the afternoon. And Philip Guston went bonkers ecstatic over this friend of mine's paintings late in the afternoon in one of the little studios up here. So, and there are other, I mean, Harold Rosenberg, who's in this book, was one of the early supporters of this school. Meyer Shapiro lectured here, the list could go on and on. So actually this building, and also this school was founded in part as a kind of response some years earlier to the closing of the Hans Hofmann School, which was also on 8th Street. So we should all be very conscious that this book, I think, is in a sense an homage to some of the values which this school exemplifies, which are that that art is not one track, that we're not on some single road going toward a more and more minimalist kind of abstraction. The fact is that this school was dedicated to the principle that the ideas of abstract expressionism and the values of drawing from life, drawing from the model, drawing from the figure, were things that you wanted to think about at the same time. And one of the things that I'm so happy about this volume in the end is that there's this whole mingling of voices with someone like Donald Judd, who I think is actually a marvelous writer, and I adore Judd's sculpture, advocating this kind of extreme radical paring down, and at the same time you have somebody like Louis Finkelstein in his essay, which I think is called Painting as Painting, talking about the continuing relevance of old values, painterly values, and how those values can be sort of reinvented in the wake of abstraction and abstract expressionism. One of the things that Geoffrey and I have sort of, there's always been talk at the Library of America, well, there should be a volume of earlier in the century and stuff. I mean, this is one of the things that was very hard about doing this book was we're trying to make this world real for a wide range of readers, hopefully, right? People beyond the kind of insider art world. And I, time and time again, would have the experience of looking at the writings by often artist writings that I was incredibly fond of. Like, for instance, Mercy's Matter, one of the founders of the school, or perhaps the founder, there are different stories about how the school was founded. Mercy's Matter in the early 60s wrote an incredible essay in Art News. It was an attack on art education in America at that time. And initially I wanted to include that, but that essay, like a number of other ones that I really loved, it was like when you read it, and you probably have this experience with things too, I realized for anybody who didn't know the whole story, it would be very, very hard to understand where it was coming from or what it was about. So one of the real struggles I found with doing this anthology was trying to find some of the less expected stuff that also could make sense to a reader who didn't have all the background.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it works because there's a certain amount of just purely narrative matter that's in there, like Peggy Guggenheim's account of showing Pollock. And all of those diaries, in particular, really offset the criticism, because the criticism is the public discourse, and then the diaries are very personal and sometimes downright hermetic. I mean, when you get to like Joseph Cornell's notebooks, which are really notes to himself and not fully comprehensible to anyone else, but totally fascinating for that reason. And so, and then also you get the back and forth. You get people responding to other people, and that crops up quite a lot. You definitely get the echo of various controversies.
I mean, one thing, I'm very attached. I love these poems by this guy, which have never been published, by, I'm trying to find this man, Dwight Ripley. Dwight Ripley was a guy who was fortunate enough to have been born to a lot of money. He was actually the man who bankrolled the Tibor Denage Gallery originally, and he wrote these poems, which they're kind of doggerel in a way, but they're extraordinarily revealing about the sort of insider gossip of the time. So you have lines like, so-called misogynist Kooning has all the ladies simply swooning. Oh, Jimmy, this is Jimmy Ernst, Jimmy, pretty boy, thou durnst, ignore the importance of being Ernst. I murmured once to J.J. Sweeney, that's the curator, poor Leonore, completely Feeney, that's Leonore Feeney, the Italian kind of quasi-surrealist. The girls of Vogue were once by Petty, who he's an illustrator of the early part of the century. Now they are all by Giacometti. And it's just, these things, here's like, the stills at christening, well, here, let's start with this. The dangling dongs and dugs of Rivers, that's Larry Rivers, give some the hots and me the shivers. The stills, that's the Cliffords, at christening sharply differed. He wanted Cliff, she wanted Clifford. Okay, so that's some argument between Clifford Still and his wife. Faced with the work of Mr. Twombly, a chink from Chile muttered humbly. And so on. I mean, these are kind of silly things, but in the context of a book, I mean, this man, Dwight Ripley, was very close friends with Clement Greenberg. And you think of Clement Greenberg's writing as very somber and solemn. And when you see that here, and this is a man who, I mean, Dwight Ripley and Clement Greenberg hung out a lot. And when you see them juxtaposed here fairly closely, you begin to get a sense of the playfulness of the period. Or Grace Hardigan's journals, which were only recently published, I mean, they are a revelation because, of course, there's no question, it was not easy to be a woman in the art world of the 50s. But it was more complicated than people say, and some people, some women, had interesting lives because it was a kind of opening up period. And when you read Grace Hardigan's journals, and she's a very attractive woman with a happy relationship, doing very well at the Tibor Denage Gallery, being bought by the Museum of Modern Art, having lots of friends. I mean, you begin to see, I mean, I think what you part of it you begin to see here is that the whole story is much more complicated than people, sort of standard issue Art 101, 20th century art courses tell. And also I was very happy that we ended not with Michael Fried, who, Art and Objecthood, I said to everybody at the Library of America, we have to have all of Art and Objecthood, which is a very ponderous essay But then we got to end with John Ashbery, and wonderful essays, portraits of Joan Mitchell and Leland Bell, who was another great friend of this school, though he complained bitterly about many things that went on at this school. So I think you get a very rich tapestry of the period, and it is my hope that it'll maybe open up some people's minds a little bit over the next few years about what the story is, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is a kind of, well, you do get this period sense. I mean, you start in the late 40s, and there's a theme of liberation and opening up that is palpable, and you think, well, this is the same moment as bebop, the same moment as method acting coming to the fore. Lots of things are going on. The same moment that all kinds of poetics from, open field composition and spontaneous bop prosody are all percolating. And the rhetoric early in the book, it really draws on that. I mean, Barnett Newman writing, "We are freeing ourselves of the impediments of memory, association, nostalgia, legend, myth, or what have you." I like that. And Meyer Shapiro, what he emphasizes is spontaneity or intense feeling as being the central source, really, for this art. And boy, does that change. I mean, by the time you get to the end, there is such skepticism and.
But of course, that's how the culture changed in that sense. I mean, the early people in this book are, in a sense, a lot of them are disaffected leftists of one kind or another. Many of them are, some of them were Marxists of one kind, some of them sort of Soviet sympathizing Marxists at some point in the 30s, and then they moved the Partisan Review crew to being Trotskyites, and then for someone like Shapiro, who his whole life remains a socialist of a kind, but the problem for them is that the sort of standard issue liberation movements of the early part of the century, like Soviet communism, have clearly run into catastrophic troubles. And I mean, in one of these essays, Meyer Shapiro goes back to the Voltaire. He says basically artists should cultivate their own garden, which is a kind of shocking, in a way, thing for a former radical to say. But for many of these people, I think it's true of Newman, it's true of Shapiro, it's really true of Rosenberg and Greenberg, all in their very different ways. For them, who had witnessed the shattering disappointments of the left through various stages in the 30s, the arts, and particularly this kind of painting, emerged as a region where freedom could be exercised, still be exercised. And of course, there's this great statement that when Trotsky had been tossed out of Russia, was in Mexico, Breton goes down and they write this extraordinary statement about the freedom of art, where Trotsky, who if he'd stayed in Russia and been in control of Russia would never have said this, but living in Mexico, he suddenly declares that any artistic expression is an expression of the revolutionary spirit. And that, which is sort of Trotsky's last hurrah, becomes, for many of these people in the early years of this book, really, that is the faith, the hope, the faith. That, and they're also, these people are flummoxed. They've hated American capitalism in the 30s. And then Roosevelt appears, and he really makes it work again. And then suddenly, they're the fascists. And then it turns out that Stalin, the Hitler-Stalin pact, and everything's sort of topsy-turvy. And after the war, they're left, they're very ambivalent still about America and American capitalism. But it's clear a lot of other alternatives are not working. So there is this retreat into this heroism of art, which I think you feel in the early sections of the book.
What's incredible is, between like about, 1947 and maybe, I don't know, 1955, which I guess is sort of the high watermark of abstract expressionism, it goes from being this kind of solitary act of liberation. I mean, the way Rosenberg describes, the act of painting as this kind of ultimate freedom and ultimate spontaneity, as against mass culture, and then the painting becomes part of it. I mean, the commercialization of the art scene begins to be a topic for these writers, and then you get the next generation of people who are mocking it, and
yeah, I mean, but the artists were always, I mean, this generation, they were the beneficiaries of American prosperity, but they were very skeptical about it. And for literally, for people like Pollock and de Kooning, they felt that very viscerally because they were sort of pioneers on Long Island. Certainly Pollock was. And then suddenly they find themselves having houses next to these Madison Avenue madmen types, and they're sort of being supported now by people who represent a world that they're opposed to. And there's a string of very interesting essays throughout this book. There's a wonderful essay by John Bernard Myers.
I was going to mention
that. Who was the director of the T. Bernage Gallery, called Junk Dump Fair Surveyed, published in the 60s in that great brief magazine, Art and Literature, which John Ashbery more or less edited. And Junk Dump Fair Surveyed is basically John Bernard Myers saying, who's a dealer, saying, this has just become, dealing in the money has become crazy. And this is in the early 60s. We also have an excerpt from a piece that I believe has never been reprinted. Dwight MacDonald, the author of the great essay, Mid-Cult, Mass Cult, who really was one of the great interpreters of sort of the whole predicament of high culture in an open democratic society. When he went to write for The New Yorker, he wrote a very long profile of Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art. And MacDonald was fascinated, and this is in the 50s, by the extent to which the Museum of Modern Art was already playing a kind of double game. On the one hand, Barr was dedicated to bringing the religion of modernism in its most complex, difficult forms to the American audience. But at the same time, Alfred Barr, and people sometimes forget this about Barr, was a showman who wanted the Museum of Modern Art to be a place where ladies who lunch went to lunch, and guys went to try to pick up girls. That was part of his plan with the Museum of Modern Art. And for Dwight MacDonald, this was like the perfect subject because it's all those paradoxes. So you have, and of course, even as early as Rosenberg's American action painters, he talks about the whole quandary of the audience, and which maybe is going to embrace the stuff but doesn't really understand it, and what does all that mean? So there's that whole thread moving through the book.
Yeah, no, it's funny because in the Myers piece, he has this funny line about the flyers that galleries are sending out, and how they're becoming more and more elaborate and artful. This is the 60s.
Already in
the 60s. The sheer dexterity and sometimes wit which goes into the design of eye-catching announcements is astonishing. It is as though each gallery were stating its claims with the ardor that goes into the selling of pharmaceuticals or vacuum cleaners. And then Harold Rosenberg also invokes vacuum cleaners as it's kind of like.
And of course, the thing about announcements, I don't know any of you get announcements from the Gagosian Gallery. Their specialty is now Larry Gagosian prints his announcements on paper that is, I swear, at the very least a quarter of an inch thick. The thing now has become, the importance of a show is measured by how thick the paper, it's not even paper, it's actually hunks of cardboard on which the announcement is printed, literally. I mean that's, but it starts, it starts way back.
It starts early, yeah. It's already in the
Yeah.
50s. And that early piece that you included by Robert Coates is already,
Right,
you have
about-
MoMA
which
doing
is
an
again
exhibit
one of these things, right?
on it's the influence of modern art on commercial design. And
Robert
then-
Coates, who's the New Yorker critic, wrote about a show called, what's it called, Modern Art in Our Time or something. Wait, what is the show called? Do you remember offhand?
I think it's got Kleenex in the title.
Well, his title for the piece is Mondrian, Kleenex, and You, but the show was called Modern Art in Your Life. And this was a typical Alfred Barr. This show was not curated by Alfred Barr, but it was typical of Alfred Barr's effort to show how modern art and modern cultural, social life in the broadest terms were integrated. So you would have a Mondrian, and then you would have some new designs for napkins, or you would have an ARP and an Eames chair, okay? And of course, Barr, as I think Barr was smart enough to know, was playing a dangerous game with this, because the problem is, are you going to elevate taste in general, or are you going to turn Mondrian and ARP and Kandinsky into basically graphic artists? I mean, it's like there's a two-way street going on here, which I think Barr was aware of. But Robert Coates, the New Yorker critic, kind of, picks up on the problematical nature of a show like this. And indeed, it's interesting, Barr, in his later years at the Museum of Modern Art, and Barr was the man who kind of wanted there to be a department of film, a department of architecture and design, a department of photography. He had this idea in the 20s, when the museum started, at the end of the 20s, of kind of integrating art and design. But interestingly enough, in his last decade or so there, his sole focus was on the permanent collection. So this is something you see. You see this with, this is part of the story of Susan Sontag, who's in here with a piece about happenings. Susan Sontag in early years was the great, preached camp and hipsterdom, and of course, in her later years, Sontag was like, what do you mean camp? I'm for the classics. I'm only for the classics. So, there is that.
Yeah, and the long piece by Greenberg, the one from 1960, I think.
The modernist, is that modernist painting?
Yeah, where he basically ends up saying that, rupture with the past has nothing to do with modernism.
Right,
and,
right,
on the contrary, it's all about the connection with the past.
Sometimes people want openness, but you want the borders to be porous, because if the borders aren't porous, you end up with academicism. This is the great conundrum of art. If the borders are not porous, you end up with academicism and the new criterion. But if the borders are too porous, you end up with pop crap. So there's this constant conundrum. Alfred Barr was finally fired as director of the Museum of Modern Art. He wouldn't leave the museum, but he was fired because the sculptor Louise Nevelson had encountered this guy who was a shoeshine man in New York, who had this really sort of cool, what we now call outsider art shoeshine stand. And she told Alfred Barr about it, and he was really into it, and he decided they should exhibit it in the entry of the Museum of Modern Art. And Stephen Clark, who was then, I think, the chairman of the board of the Modern, who had been feeling for a number of years that Alfred Barr, although he was a very smart guy, really was a terrible administrator and didn't know what he was doing. Stephen Clark walked into the museum and saw this basically outsider art shoeshine stand, and it was like, this is it. And he then attempted to fire Alfred Barr, who basically would not leave the museum. and went into the library and proceeded to write his book about Matisse, and then basically after 5 or 6 years sort of won this kind of quiet battle, and remained there until the end of his life. I did want to ask you, I mean, Geoffrey's a poet, and I mean, of course, this book is full of writings about art by poets, and which is such an interesting thing, which of course goes back to ancient times, this whole mysterious thing of ut pictura poesis, which nobody, I don't know, I can never remember, it actually means as in painting, so in poetry, but the Renaissance misunderstood it and thought it went the other way, as in poetry, so as in painting.
Well,
it goes both ways. So
ways.
What do you think about as a poet now? I mean, what is your feeling about all these poets in the 50s who had this extraordinary comfort? Is it with the painters? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you're talking especially about a particular group of poets. I mean, you're talking about Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, James Schuyler, Creeley, in a different way. Well, I mean, part of it was social, obviously. I mean, it was simply a congenial environment for all concerned. The painters liked the poets hanging around, as I think, does O'Hara say that somewhere? And the poets liked to hang around with the painters. So it was that kind of exchange. I mean, it wasn't really, I mean, if you look at O'Hara's poetry or Ashbery's poetry, it's not especially involved with ekphrasis or any kind of very literal attempt to recreate the effect of one art in another. It's more a sense of just being kind of saturated. Schuyler has that line about the floods of paint in whose surf we all float about, or whatever the phrase is. Well, and James Agee is another one. I mean, marginal to this book, and yet interesting to me because, well, he's writing about photography, and aside from being a poet, he was also a movie critic. So, he's more involved with seeing the photographs as in the same way that he looks at movies, and in a way the same kind of eye he brings to descriptive writing.
I mean, the method, you mentioned method acting at the beginning, and I mean, the theater and the dance were also something that
Merce Cunningham's name comes up many times.
Right. And the fact that, I mean, that Tennessee Williams, it's said that Pollock was part of the inspiration for Stanley Kowalski. I mean, this is sort of rumor, maybe more than anything else, but the kind of breaking open of theater at that time. I mean, I think there were analogies, and there also were. I mean, there apparently were some discussion. The New York City Ballet and Balanchine, which was kind of an obsession of some of the artists, and certainly of O'Hara.
Yeah.
There was there was apparently perhaps talk of some perhaps the Kooning doing sets for the New York City Ballet, which would have made a lot of sense because, of course, the New York City Balanchine did all these black and white ballets, and black and white was such a thing among, if you think of de Kooning's black and white paintings, Pollock's, Klein's, Motherwell. I mean, black and white was a kind of theme that ran through the period. So there are all these kind of...
that kind of thing never quite happened then, I think, because now things like that happen because the funding is in place for things like that to happen. Large-scale collaborations between visual artists and musicians and playwrights, but...
I mean, I think Balanchine also, I have this theory that because Balanchine had started out with Diaghilev and been forced as a young choreographer to work with these very restrictive costumes by De Chirico and other people. I think Balanchine, by the time he had his own freedom in New York, was like, I don't want artists telling me what my dancers should wear, frankly. I mean, so he...
But there is all of that. I mean, the fact that Edwin Denby, who writes so beautifully about de Kooning in here, also was the greatest dance critic of the period. And he writes in very similar ways. I mean, he has that great essay, about people in the street.
Dancers, buildings, and people in the streets, which is totally relevant to the art. I mean, and probably some of the ideas. I mean, he talks in one of the essays about de Kooning here about walking. I mean, in the 30s, Denby and de Kooning walk the streets late at night and look around, and then later in this essay, which was a lecture originally given to dance students, Denby talked about how in New York, the building, the streetscape is so surprising because there'll be a skyscraper next to an abandoned lot, next to some old brownstones. And that idea of these strange juxtapositions is, I'm convinced, something that actually came from conversations with de Kooning, who liked that idea of this sort of surprising juxtaposition.
Well, that's right at the beginning of the book, and this is in the 30s. I mean, this is Denby...
remembering the right.
Meeting de Kooning, who's living in the same building, and they go walking on the street, and he describes de Kooning pointing out to me on the pavement the dispersed compositions, spots and cracks and bits of wrappers and reflections of neon light. This is right at the beginning. And, this is like 1936 or something.
Yeah, actually, maybe I was going to say maybe we should open up the questions.
Yeah.
So why don't you be the first one?
I'm sort of not getting. If you would please wait for the mic for recording, and we would like to be able to record you and hear you in the back. Okay?
Okay. So they're going to bring you a mic.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm kind of not hearing what your point of view is in writing this book. Is it a democratic kind of reportage of the times, or do you have a particular axe to grind? Or I'm sort of not getting the context in which all of this material...
First of all, I didn't write this book. It's a collection of writings by 87...
But you chose...
I chose them, but my idea was to... I particularly feel this is not my... I'm not grinding my axe here, okay? The idea of this book was to bring together what are already generally agreed upon to be a kind of established, and I hate the word, but if we'll use it, canonical texts, ranging from Greenberg and Rosenberg to Leo Steinberg and Michael Fried. And people who know my writing well know that I have profound disagreements with Michael Fried. But that was not the point. But I also, I mean, yes, I think you used the word democratic. My hope was then to open the picture of this 25-year period to include many other things, some of which I have deep personal attachments to, others of which I don't have deep personal attachments to. The idea was to try to let light and air into the story of these 25 years, so that different people could go into this anthology and use it in different ways and find, number one, the basic things that they want and need if they're teaching a course or looking for references, and beyond that, to find other things, some of which they will like, some of which they will dislike, some of which hopefully will lead some of readers of this book to go and look up other things by some of these writers, and maybe even get some books published of the collected writings of people like Thomas B. Hess, who was the extraordinary editor of Art News and then wrote for New York Magazine and is really an amazing critic, or Sidney Tillum, who was a very important critic, especially in the 1960s and 70s.
Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. Did you discover along the way who actually created, who had the most role in creating the vocabulary to explain this extraordinary break with art as we had known it up to that point? Was it the critics more, or was it the artists, or did they teach one another? Did they steal from one another, perhaps, in terms of defining what this was all about?
Well, all the early group of critics, the first wave of critics, Greenberg, Rosenberg, Shapiro. Part of this is sort of local history. These men, certainly Greenberg and Rosenberg, I do not think set out to be art critics. The Offices of Partisan Review, this extraordinarily important magazine, which began as a sort of anti-Stalinist leftist magazine in the late 30s, had its offices on Astor Place. Everybody was hanging around in the same places. As Geoffrey said, I mean, partly it was social with these people. Greenberg, Rosenberg, and Shapiro, who set out to be an art historian, getting degrees at Columbia, they were excited, emboldened by the work they were seeing in the studios they came into as friends of artists, people they ran into in this neighborhood, literally, this very neighborhood. The interesting thing is, I think the artists, the critics learned a lot from the artists in their studio, and then you find different critics attempting to explain this work in very, very different ways. And I mean, as I say in the introduction, in a sense, you can pick out two different strands that emerge. One, which is the strand of Rosenberg and Shapiro, really, emphasizes this new art, the art of de Kooning Pollock, as an art that is an expression of a kind of personal freedom, especially a personal freedom at a time when it seems like sort of the larger movement of social freedom, of socialism or whatever has been stopped. So personal freedom becomes very important. Rosenberg talks about the canvas as an arena in which to act. Now, of course, the problem with that whole line of interpretation is that it can lead to a kind of anarchic, nihilistic thing where is anybody's version of freedom as good as anybody else's? You know, then what is quality? Okay, Greenberg evolves this whole other way of talking about this art, which sees this art as not really coming from the artist to the canvas, but in a sense the artist grappling with what are the fundamental necessities of art itself, okay? So that art kind of has this ordering discipline for the artist, and the artist kind of plunges into the conundrum of what essentially a painting is, and that's what Greenberg sees Pollock is doing. So you actually have, I mean, one of the great things about this anthology, I think, is you have different people responding to the same art in different ways. Or you have Parker Tyler, who's a fascinating critic of movies and gay life and writing about Pollock, and he basically writes about Jackson Pollock as a kind of weird surrealist doing these kind of surrealist labyrinthine dream worlds,
actually,
which is so different from the way Greenberg talks about Pollock. But one of the things, frankly, I love about looking at the range of this period is that you have different people very persuasively talking about the same work in different ways, which are equally or
in entirely different ways, and the artists often speaking about it in utterly different terms than Clement Greenberg is using. But
apropos of the last question, do you include the conversations that were from the club and the journals that were printed? I think it's, what is it, Tis?
It is. Yes, there's a lot of stuff from It Is. There are a bunch of brief kind of journal notes that Jack Turkov wrote some of which are directly responses to evenings at the club. And there's an essay by the, unfortunately, largely almost altogether forgotten artist, Alfred Russell, toward Metaform, which is from It Is. I mean, It Is incredible journal, and we do have a bunch of stuff from there. Yeah, I mean, the little magazines of the period are just, I mean, they're so cool, and many of them they're not digital. A lot of this material isn't simply not available in any form, except here, right?
Hi, I'm wondering whether the relationship between the music of the time and the art of the time gets into this volume at all. I know that there are a lot of artists who like to go to the 5 spot, for example, and hear bebop and so forth.
Well, Morton Feldman is in the book. I mean, Morton Feldman has, is it 1 or 2? I mean,
Yeah, and John Cage is in the book.
And John Cage. Yeah, so there's definitely
There isn't much about jazz except, you know, there are some allusions. It doesn't get into
Well, I have to say, one of the
specifics,
weird things, and when I wrote a book called New Art City about a decade ago, about this period, and one of the things that drove me crazy, I have to say, when I was working on New Art City is there is very little written by the visual arts people that even overlaps with jazz. And it was a great frustration for me when I was doing New Art City, because I wanted to make some of those connections, and it was extremely difficult. I mean, one of the weird things about history is that some things that you know are there, there's nothing.
Well, there are things that are so commonplace that nobody even bothers to write it down.
Right, it's like everybody was listening every night, so nobody mentioned it. It may, in fact, be almost that crazy. But I remember from when I was working on New Art City that I found it very hard to actually find things I could use that actually made that connection in a powerful way.
Well, obviously you get it in Frank O'Hara's poetry. I mean,
right, yes, you get it, you unquestionably get it in the rhythms, but I think you're right. Some of these things, it's like, you know, one of the frustrating things is if people who are close friends are living in different cities, you'll have letters, but if people are living down the block from each other for 5 years and having the most intense engagement, there'll be nothing left, you know, because they were talking every day. It's a very weird thing in his, you know, just in how things get recorded. Very frustrating sometimes.
You read the poem by Robert Creeley. What was the title of it? What is the title?
Well, it's not a poem. that's an art review. Yeah, I mean that's Creeley's idea of how to write an art review. It's just called John Chamberlain, and
I have to say, I don't. Was that in Art News? I mean, Art News under Thomas Hess was so welcoming to a range of different kinds of art writing, and
it was actually from a monograph or
I mean, you would have
a catalog. Yeah.
I mean, one of the sad things. I mean, in a way, the blogosphere has sort of replaced this, but one of the sad things is there are fewer print art magazines in New York today, and they're very they're reluctant to publish some of the kind of poetic writings. I mean, there were things published by, you know, a Fairfield Porter who has a lot of stuff in art magazines or even in The Nation in the 60s and 70s that I'm like, I mean, my God, I mean, the editor would let this out. I mean, there were 4.5 readers who would actually understand this thing. I mean, I had to read it 30 times to get what he was saying. I mean, but I love that you can write something kind of weird and crazy that would have been published in a more or less mainstream periodical.
And yet, I would argue that, in fact, the language of art criticism became much more difficult after this period.
Right. Became kind of.
I mean, it achieved a kind of theoretical impenetrability.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
This is more free form and, you know, really embracing the irrational at times.
Well, you say that as a poet, Geoffrey. You know.
When anthologies like this appear, smart alecky critics and readers love to go right for the jugular and point out what you left out. And I'm wondering who you left out, or better said, who you wish there had been room to include. And also, is there anyone outside of Manhattan?
Oh yes, there's lots of. We have L.A., we have San Francisco. We have we have the whole West Coast. Yes, we do have the West Coast. We have Forum stuff by Phil Leader. We have Mark Toby. We have, yes, we do. Left out is a funny question. I mean, one of the conundrums here was, because the Library of America is dedicated to this sort of American literary excellence, when I started, I have to say, I was very focused on, I wanted everything in the book to have what I thought was sort of literary quality. And in the many years we worked on this, I went through something of an evolution. And sometimes one felt certain writers, I am not a fan of Rosalind Krauss, but Rosalind Krauss is in the book because I felt it was important, because she was beginning to be important at the end of this period in Art Forum. But one of the both the strengths of this collection and one of the things that makes answering your question a conundrum is we wanted this to be a collection where the edges were bleeded out a little bit, that the edges were a little bit fuzzy, so that you know, there are things that could have been in that aren't. I mean, we kind of got, I think, 900 pages about what you like.
Yeah.
The max. So we kind of got to the max of what you could fit into a book like this. And I think there are many other things that could be in, and I think somebody else doing it would have put in other things. I've also, I have to say, used the introductory notes to each person, to each selection, as a way to point to other things. I mean, like Louis Finkelstein, who's represented by this essay, which I think is called Painting is Painting. He wrote an incredibly important essay called, which some people say, and some people didn't say, coined the term, well, it was called, the essay was called in Art News, Abstract Impressionism, A New Look. And it was about the revival of interest in Monet in the 50s and how that was leading artists in a lot of different directions. And I ended up not including that because it was one of these essays that discusses a lot of artists very specifically, and you would need a lot of illustration. But I talk about it in the introductory note so that hopefully people will be led to that. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think, I mean, you know, when you're doing something like this where you wake up in the morning and think, oh, damn, I should have that Rosenberg in and not that one. There's such a wealth of stuff. Yes, there are always other things. But I think in a way, hopefully that's part of the point, you know, that you have that sense that it could be slightly different. So it has that openness.
I find it very interesting what you're doing because I think culture is so hard to in any way catch. It's so elusive. And the idea of making a mosaic to get a zeitgeist, at first you won't get an overwhelming theme. I once taught a course called 1912, and I invited every single field to come. And people say, how are they going to make any sense out of it? But in the end, the connective links began to show. And when you were speaking, I suddenly began to see connective links with what's happening today. Just little tidbits of what you said, I suddenly saw a linkage that took place. So I think it's a very important way to begin to understand culture, that it's so vast, there's so many forces. So when you say, well, what starts at what comes first, whether it's a painting style or an idea, it's impossible. That's the excitement, I think, of what you're trying to do. And I think it's a wonderful, it really sounds very good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, you know, people, there's an inclination to write history as a one story because it's easier that way. But history is really, at any moment, is kind of a mess. I mean, it's, you know, sometimes a wonderful, fascinating, enchanting mess, but messy.
I have two questions. I didn't hear when the beginning and end dates are, and are they just
45 to 70.
So just
the end of the war to basically the beginning of Soho, to this of Soho art was kind of how we conceived it.
well, in your introductory, well, I actually have another one. In your introductions, do you say why, in fact, you have included certain people or certain of their writings? Or it's just...
I don't give an explanation for every single one. I mean, I think in the introductions to each writer, it becomes fairly evident why they're there, what their importance is.
And
I mean, and
last,
partly, you know, I mean, I would like people to look at this and say, well, yeah, that's important and interesting and odd, and I would have included, you know, X as well, or Z as well, and I think that's fine, that's good.
and lastly, you said that Philip Guston praised a friend of yours and went bananas. What happened to that young artist?
He still paints, and he teaches painting in the Boston area.
Tell us who it was.
Will there be a volume of such work prior to 1945?
Well,
You have to ask the editor of the Library of America about that.
That is under consideration.
I think we're probably,
All right.
thank you very much.